So Betty wrote a book. She researched it for 5 years. As part of her research, she discovered that Freud had written a letter to a colleague that said, "Despite my studying women for over 30 years, I still do not know what women want most." Now, at this point, I got really mad because I knew the story of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell, which was in the 5th century, a King Arthur tale. And what women want most is their sovereignty, their right to make choices. And it was known in the 5th century. And Freud was studying women for 30 years, and he didn't trip over that little fact. Mm-hmm. And he had the nerve to write about women, even though he didn't know what women wanted most. I also was a psychology major, but I had never bought into what Freud was selling, especially this penis envy business. I mean, I have personally never experienced penis envy. The closest I ever came was when hiking, and I would desperately be looking for an outhouse instead of a substantial bush. And then there was a little envy, but it was only because it was exterior plumbing, not what Freud was trying to sell. And the uterus. Now, the uterus is a nifty organ, but you never hear about uterus envy. But this is a digression. Back to Betty. So Betty's research, not surprisingly, discovered that Freud's idea of women's role was a major cause of the feminine mystique. That's what she called the idea that women should be satisfied with just the role of wife and mother. She concluded that while perhaps it had been true in Vienna in Freud's time, it wasn't true anymore. She ended her book, "The feminine mystique is no longer a valid guide to women's lives because it is obsolete. A woman has the power to choose and to make her own heaven or hell." The book was published in 1963. Betty was 42 years old. It made the New York Times bestsellers list. In fact, it only fell off the New York Times bestsellers list when her astonished publisher couldn't keep up with the demand. And once the books got back out into the bookstores, it went right back on the bestsellers list. She sold 3 million copies in the first 3 years. Whenever she spoke, women would come up to her afterwards and say, "I'm so glad you wrote that book. I thought I was the only one who felt out of place." Now, the Friedan family were suddenly wealthy. They bought an apartment in the Dakota Building on Central Park West in New York City, where John Lennon lived, and a summer home on Fire Island off of Long Island. That was the public part of what happened with the feminine after the feminine mystique. The private part, Betty's husband started beating her up. A colleague in the women's movement later wrote, "At that time, if you knew you were going to be on television with Betty Friedan, you always showed up early to help her with her makeup to hide her black eyes." At least once, her husband tried to push her out of a moving vehicle. Luckily, a friend witnessed this, had her husband stop the car. The friend got Betty into his car and he drove Betty home. He happened to be a divorce lawyer. He said, "Betty, you can stop all this. Divorce him." "I can't divorce him. I need a husband to take me places. I'm a Smith graduate. Smith graduates don't get divorced." "Betty, he could have killed you just then. Get a divorce. Stop all this." "I can't get a divorce." It hurt me so much that while Betty could fight for women, she couldn't fight for herself. She stayed with her husband for 6 more years, only divorcing him finally when she said, "I was afraid that the scar tissue around my eyes from all the black eyes was going to become permanent." Some choices are hard to make. Perhaps some activists are born pushing the envelope every moment of their lives. But others, like Betty, are forged by the events in their lives. I am so very glad that Betty wrote that book, The Feminine Mystique, in time for me. Because when I graduated from college in '72, I had lots of choices. I chose to become a computer programmer. I also married right out of college, but I continued working. I got my master's degree one course at a time while working, both before and after our son was born. And I continued working, which was just as well because my husband was laid off when he was 50 and our son was 12. He chose to go to law school. Because I had a good job, I was able to support our family during that 3-year period. My husband was pleased I could do that, and so was I. Choices. Aren't they what everyone wants?